All right, welcome to another episode of 15 Minutes of College, folks. I'm the Professor Ryan Masters. So we're going to get into memory, a big overview, and particularly long-term memory and some hacks. So here we go. So what is memory? It's the process of storing and retrieving information, and as in any process, there are successive steps or stages that are essential for it to work. So the three stages that we've become a bit more familiar with, the three-box model, if you will, sensory memory being that first stage, short-term being that second stage, and then finally long-term memory. So this is essentially getting back into sensory memory. We have lessons that we're trying to learn. We have information that's coming at us for the first time, hits us in our prefrontal cortex, and then it can be forgotten pretty quickly. Or we work with it and it can be remembered. So what is sensory memory? The first stage, of course. And this is where information enters our brain through our five senses. So it only holds new information for a few seconds, according to George Sperling, though, and his experiments. If you recall the flashing light experiments that we kind of talked about, it lasts for less than a second. You can blast information at somebody. Here's a quick row of like 4 letters, and then with less than a second, people can kind of recall that. But if you wait for more than a second after you blast those 4 letters for just a quick flash, the memory decays. That information goes away. It's essentially forgotten. So this shows that sensory memory is extremely limited in its capacity, and new information is easily erased unless you purposely pay attention to information and you intend to remember it. And then, of course, this intention, how you interact with this information, can transfer it to short-term memory, the second stage. So here we have short-term memory still in the prefrontal lobe, but now the hippocampus has come into play. Do we reject this data, or do we allow this data, this information, to go on through to the other side? Think of long-term memories like the VIP room. Your hippocampus is the bouncer, and the short-term memory is kind of the waiting room. You're in the club, but you're not in the VIP room yet. And you can always get kicked out at any minute. So, in the second stage of the memory process, like sensory memory, short-term memory is temporary, and it's limited in its capacity. So, information stays in your sensory memory for about a few seconds, or according to George Sperling, less than a second. But it can be stored in your short-term memory for several minutes. So if we're going from several seconds with sensory, less than a second typically, now we can go for perhaps 30 seconds to a handful of minutes if you intentionally work with this information, if you make it meaningful. So some information, though, does seem to travel from sensory memory right to short-term memory and even to long-term memory without any real conscious effort on your part. A big factor of this is if it's a really meaningful or traumatic experience. Like a car crash is a great example. Something that incorporates all 5 senses, overwhelming sensory overload. The sense of taste, touch, smell, sight, sound. It's really meaningful because perhaps has impacted your ability to survive. So this is why we typically see it with traumatic experiences where this kind of information transfers over, where people say, I'll never forget the day when ... So short-term memory, when it comes to promoting it, we want to talk about recall of words. So according to current brain studies, the average person can hold on to about 5 to 7 bits of information. This is what George Miller called the 5+2 or -2 model. So we can hold about 5 to 7 or, about 3 to 5 bits of data on average at any given time. And that's assuming that we've intended to learn that information, that we intend to remember that information. Otherwise, it might be a lot lower. So the most important thing to remember about short-term memory is that you must do something to retain the information. So some of those things that we've talked about before are mnemonics, mind tricks to recall information. So things like acronyms, right? Words made by using the first letters of the word that are needed to remember the whole thing. So if we're looking to remember the Great Lakes, we might use Holmes, right? Huron, Ontario, Michigan, Erie, Superior, Holmes. Acrostics are another one. They use the first letter of each term to make a phrase. So please excuse my dear Aunt Sally, right? So that is the order of operations, PEMDAS. An anagram, same thing, created by using and writing the first letter of each key word we intend to use. So you can see in the lower right-hand corner the order of operations there. So either PEMDAS as an anagram or as an acrostic, please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. Another big one is chunking. So chunking is a technique that used to organize information by reducing isolated terms. So if we're given a string of numbers, we want to break it up, right? So we have this string of numbers you can see right here. And now all of a sudden when we have a telephone number system, we have the area code, the first 3 digits and the last 4 digits, hyphenated, broken up into 3 different sections. It makes it a lot easier to remember. Furthermore than that, you can use a rhyme or a song or some other scheme as a means to help you remember what clearly on the left you can see is just a string of useless numbers. They have no real meaning. But all of a sudden we give meaning to them with those 2 hyphens and we recognize it immediately as a telephone number. So we've chunked it. But you can do, and a lot of people do this, right? When they're trying to remember a phone number, they don't have their phone with them. They don't have a pen or paper or anything to remember it. They try to repeat it in their head. 313-596-2474, right? They try to come up with some sort of like phone song or phone rhyme that helps them remember it. And they recall it, they repeat it over and over and over again as a means to remember. And that's one way we can push it from just a handful of seconds to a handful of minutes for what we remember in our short-term memory. But the problem with short-term memory is that there's no real storage going on there. Remember, you can hold 5 to 7 bits or 7 to 10 on the really high side, and then you forget it. Because if you don't continuously work with this information, it's clearly not all that meaningful. We tend to operate with short-term memory when we're just trying to remember something on the fly. We write it down, we move on with our lives. But if we're really looking to remember, to store and organize this information, this is where the real mind hacks come in long-term memory. So what is long-term memory exactly? It's the final stage. This is where information has gone through sensory memory. We engaged as many of our senses, ideally, as possible to remember this information, because if you're just using sight and you're just using hearing, 2 out of 5, that's a failing grade on a quiz. So this is another reason why it's so difficult to learn new information. That and we don't recognize some of the classic tricks or strategies that we should be using to help us promote solid long-term memory organization and then later retrieval. So once information reaches our long-term memory, it's stored permanently. Now you might be like, well, that can't be possible, because I've definitely known things and I've forgotten those things. You have. The information has been stored, perhaps not very effectively though, and your ability to retrieve and recall that information is a very separate process as organizing and storing information. So the longer it takes for you to consistently retrieve information, the longer it's going to take to recall it at any point in time. So whenever you get that tip of the tongue scenario, like, oh God, I know the name of that actor in that one movie. God, and then you go to bed and you wake up the next morning like, Gary Busey. Why was I thinking Gary Busey? I don't know. But you were thinking it and it happened. And eventually it comes back to you. You don't think about it often, so it takes a long time to retrieve that stored information. But once information is stored, it's stored permanently, but it cannot be stored unless it goes through sensory and then short-term memory. So this is why understanding information and organization of information equals long-term memory. This is promoting good memory. See, if you're given information and you don't understand it, you're not going to organize it. It's not going to be organized effectively, and you're not going to be able to effectively recall it or retrieve it at a later point in time. So the way to organize and study your information will determine how easily you are able to retrieve it at a later point in time. So the single most important aspect of memory is understanding what you are trying to remember. How effective you organize information is vital to how well you will remember it. So a big aspect is making information meaningful. Make a connection. How can you do that? What's a way we can make connection? Well, through some memory hacks. Understanding the information is probably pivotal. It's first. If I'm given vocabulary and I don't understand the definitions of those words, and now I'm told to sort of analyze a document and I have to write an essay response, but 5 of the 7 vocabulary words I was given I don't understand or know, right? It's not likely that I'm going to learn this information effectively. It's not likely that it's been meaningful because I didn't take any time to understand this information. And so now my brain can't really organize this information. So the likelihood of it storing it permanently, let alone retrieving it, it goes down. It goes down drastically. So learning difficult vocabulary is pivotal as a memory hack in understanding information. But using research for new information, use analogies. When you come across new information, it's important to try to make sense of it. Linking new information with old information is a strong way we create a neural network. It's one of the easiest ways we can create lasting memories. I've taken in new data. I don't quite understand the information. So I try to relate it to something that I do understand, that is familiar. Something ideally that I think about very often. Because now when I link this new information with an old prior concept, a memory that I'm very familiar with, perhaps I consume that memory on a weekly, if not daily basis, the likelihood that I can retrieve this new information I'm learning, it improves drastically. So reviewing what you've learned on a regular basis is huge. Go back, read Cornell summaries, read your notes. We're talking 5 minutes of your day, every day. It's so much better than 3-hour cram session, or 3+ hour cram session the night before for a test. And this is something that a lot of college students struggle with, is the consistency of study. And of course, create a memory matrix, or better known as a mind map. As you can see, I have this in the upper right-hand corner. The more visual, the better. We're visual creatures by nature. In fact, we increase our recall of information by 80% when we put that information in and attach it to a visual aid. So you kind of see up here, memory would go here, and then you'd have like long-term memory, short-term memory, sensory memory, then a keyword that's attached to it, an idea about it, some notes. And this helps us to, 1, take notes, and of course make it more visual so we can recall it. So now about memory. It kind of goes like this as an overview. Environmental stimuli from the 5 senses. Then we activate our short-term memory, and then it's forgotten. Or we keep working with that information through rehearsal. We do things like mapping, charting, creating timelines, flashcards, questions and answers, and then it moves to long-term memory. And then it can be forgotten. Or we continue to keep working with it, and we rehearse, talk-throughs, practice essays, we teach it, we create possible questions, and then permanent storage. And that's basically memory in a nutshell, folks. You going to remember all that? Let's see. Have a good one, folks. Take it easy. This has been 15 Minutes of College.